Where He Brought Me From, the documentary airing February 2022, is not just a pre- and post-slavery documentary about the evolution of an African American family in the U.S. It's also my story. The story of how one African American family who came from humble beginnings contributes daily to their family and their community. So before you begin, grab you some popcorn and call the whole family together as you sit back and relax and enjoy the backstory about how the North meets the South. The North being the upper region of the country in upstate New York. Now, when non-New Yorkers think of the state, they think downstate New York City is the whole state. Yeah, New York State is much bigger than that. You see, I was born and raised here in Rochester, New York, which is in the upstate region of New York next to Buffalo. Now, Rochester is known for its large corporations like Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, Paychex, Coca-Cola, and the University of Rochester. We're conveniently next door to one of the 7 wonders of the world, which crosses 2 countries, the U.S. and Canada, a place known as Niagara Falls. Now, the southern part of this story is one from the lower region of the country in the state of Alabama, and a small county named Bullock, along with its neighboring counties. They say big things come in small packages. So just because these counties may be small, some famous people called these places home, like this soulful tenor, original founding member of the Temptations, Mr. Eddie Kendricks. Then there's this woman who boldly took a seat in the front row of a bus, Ms. Rosa Parks, reared from Macon County, the home of the University of Tuskegee. In neighboring town, Barber County, is the home of George Wallace. Okay, I know. I'm sure right about now you might be scratching your head and wondering, what does any of this have to do with her documentary? Well, it's been said, when you die, you will no longer be remembered after 2 generations have gone by. Well, as a child growing up in the 70s, all I ever knew was what I'd experienced here in Rochester. And yes, the photographer told us to make a fist. Well, then one day in 1976, the whole country was captivated for 7 days watching Roots, the story about Alex Haley, a man who took the oral stories about his ancestors' journey from Africa into the shackles of slavery and traced his lineage back to Africa. Like many African Americans who got to witness this epic tale, I too knew I would figure out how and who my family was. Well, in 1984, when I graduated from Edison Tech High School, I had the opportunity to work for either Kodak, where my mother worked as an administrator, or Straw Memorial Hospital, where my grandmother worked in housekeeping department as a delegate, whatever that was. Now, early on in life, I knew I wanted to have my own business. So I decided to work it strong. Yes, in the housekeeping department. Why, you might wonder? Well, 1, I wanted to have my own business, so I knew I'd never retire from there. Then 2, Kodak was a 9-to-5 corporate job. And based on the struggle my mother was having as a Black woman working in corporate America in the 80s, I didn't want any part of that. So if I worked at the hospital, I'd always try to figure out how to leave to start my own business. So Straw Memorial it was. Even though I worked full-time, I did in fact start my own business by getting my first DBA and consulting for the Rochester Housing Authority, hosting summer and fall programs for their youth and senior communities. You see, there were no community centers back then, and I wanted to be the difference in my community. Then a few years later, I opened the first Vendor and Shoppers Bazaar. It was an incubator where small businesses united to provide a one-stop shop collective in the heart of the city. I even organized the first block party held on West Main Street to honor the contributions of Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and Harriet Tubman. We named this corridor of the city Freedom Way. And yes, these pioneers made their home here in Rochester, New York as well. Along with others like Austin Stewart, who was a runaway slave who came to Rochester in 1816 and opened his own meat market on what is now West Main Street? Or how about Dr. Freddie Thomas, scientist, inventor, biologist, and scholar, who moved to Rochester in 1952 and is known for his pioneering research in genetics and plastic surgery at the University of Rochester? Well, unfortunately, like many of my business ventures, I was ahead of my time. So after a couple of years of trying to make that initiative happen, I had to close my doors. Then one day at a family gathering at my aunt's house, who was the go-to place for what seemed like the neighborhood, I asked my aunt, who were those people over there I didn't recognize? This is exactly how she explained it. Oh, that's brother. Brother Dallas married Sis Ann. They had a son named Cornbread. Cornbread, brother is named Brother. You don't know Brother? Nope. Enough was enough. It was time for me to pick up my pen and paper and figure out my root story, my family's history. So the first thing I did was collect all the pictures I could get my hands on from family members. Then I started writing down what I knew. I wrote down as much as I knew about my parents and then my grandparents. I then wrote down how many children my grandmother had. Yeah, and then I wrote down how many siblings I knew she had. And then how many people called my grandmother aunt by letter, even when I didn't know how she was their aunt. So after I thought I had done all the legwork I could on my own, I picked up the phone, called my grandmother and asked, Mama, how many sisters and brothers do you have? This is what she said. Well, first, Papa's name was Henry James Anderson, and they say he had 23 kids. Second, he wasn't from around here. They say he was from Barber County. Third, he bought 7 marriage licenses, but he only married 7 times. They say one of them times she walked in the front door and he walked out the back door. Fourth, he was a traveling preacher. He preached every other Sunday at different churches, but his home church was in High Log. And fifth, he was 30 years older than Mama. Okay. Sixth, his mama was named Grandma Creasy. She died before I was born. Seventh, my mama name was Elizabeth Cope. She spelled her name Coopes and not Copes. My grandpa was named Peter Cope, and he was Park Creek Indian. And Papa worked for the WPA on the railroad. One time they gave him some green cloth, and Mama made us some dresses out of that cloth. Yeah, needless to say, I was in total shock. Who was this woman? Apparently, I didn't know anything about her and their life in Alabama. So I started by asking her to tell me the names of her siblings, because how in the world could her papa have 23 people who looked like her? Well, she started out by saying, there was Callie. She married a man named Tallis Washington. Then there was Uncle Felix. They say he left and went to Atlanta. Sis Phyllis married Surrey Calhoun. Brooke Kinley married Sis Dunn. Sis Annis married Annie Cooper. Louisa married James Brooks. Sis Sarah married Walt Rabin. Brother Dallas married Annie Mae Rabin. Jesse married Newt. Abel married Robert Fitzpatrick. Red married Hezekiah. And then there's Ernest. I asked her, where was the rest of the siblings, since this was only 12? Well, needless to say, that was more than enough for one telephone call. So I started calling her on a regular basis, to get the tea. I discovered there were some kids who either died as infants or when they were young, so they never really grew up to have children of their own. You see, in the South, folks honored the life of all of their children. So I decided to go over there to talk to her face to face. She told me the story of how her mama's full name was really Emma Marlilla Lucina Lucana, Luvana Elizabeth, Sasha Lee Francis Cope. I knew there was something meaning to this name, but that day she didn't know what it meant. I then asked her if she had any obituaries, and she had me look in her dresser drawer, and I was shocked and amazed when I found the obituaries of her sister and her brother. Her sister Phyllis was born in 1883, and her brother Dallas was born in 1897. I was actually touching obituaries of people born in the late 1880s. I was excited to know more, so it was time for me to do some more researching. Now, it was about the late 1990s. I was working as a secretary on the neonatal intensive care unit. So one morning I was sharing my story with one of the neonatologists, and he suggested I look on the internet to see what I could find. I was like, on what? He walked me to one of the back offices and showed me the computer and how to search. He shared I could come in there anytime, so I went to work 1 hour early each day, and even on weekends to see what I could find on the internet about my family. The first thing I searched for was Henry James Anderson. Lord, the only returns I got back were for Hans Christian Andersen. I knew he was a white man, so I knew that wasn't it. I knew I'd need to take a trip down south to get more information. Every year, my grandmother and aunt went down south to Union Springs around the 4th of July. So that's what I do. This was my first trip, going as an adult, from Rochester, New York to Bullitt County, Alabama. So we packed up the truck and did like the Beverly Hillbillies, got ready for a road trip down south that was supposed to only take 16 hours and 22 minutes. I took printers, cases of paper. My mama took coolers because there was nothing like bringing fruit, vegetables, and meat home from the south. We even took my daughter's best friend Chantel with us that year. So with mama, grandma, my nieces and nephew in the van, we were off. This 16.5-hour trip took us 22.5 hours. And although we was ready to pull our hair out, pluck our teeth out of our mouths, we made it in safely. That's what mattered most. My grandmother and aunt stayed with Aunt Lee McGrady. They were double cousins. Gert, her daughter, lived next door, so we stayed with Gert. I'd never felt and experienced this much hospitality before from people I'd never met, just because we was considered family. After getting settled in and meeting the new cousins, I was ready to hit the ground running until I realized there was no cell phone or internet reception. So we took a drive through town for me to see where my family was from. Driving from Aunt Lee's house in Fort Davis to the center of Bullitt took a total of 6 minutes. I got to see the courthouse and probate buildings, the Piggly Wiggly, the meat market, the lay of the land. I also took photos of my nieces and nephew on the field trial Capitol statue in the center of town. I saw the Allen and Carter funeral homes, which are where most of the African American deceased were prepared. I saw City Hall and the police department. I was told some of Joe Anderson's children worked there. I hadn't met them yet. I then saw Fort Davis post office. Now next, my mother showed me around to the places where she lived and played. They lived in Fort Davis and Macon County, so we drove around town looking at some of the old landmarks and homes of times past. Driving from Fort Davis through Bullitt County would take you all of 15 minutes. From there, we went to Thompson Station to see Dut. She was Sis Phyllis' daughter. She lived in a beautiful double-wide trailer and shared some photos of her mother, and we got to see some of Dut's grandchildren. Thompson Station used to be called the Greenwood Community, and that was where practically all of the Andersons, Brooks, Calhouns, and other African Americans lived post-slavery, even the Wiggums. That's where my family migrated to after they left Barber County in the 1880s. Now, we drove down to Indian Creek in Inverness. First, we went to see the Cope Homestead. I was excited to see the area and the houses that were there. Many of my grandmother's maternal history is tied to that family, so I wanted to see the area. Plus, I found out there were 2 sets of Copes that lived in the area. We then drove over to Mount Calvary Baptist and the Mallet Chapel Church and Cemetery. Many of the African American Copes are buried in this churchyard cemetery, as well as some of the older McGrady's. There's 2 sets of McGrady's also, I discovered. Before we left Indian Creek and headed over to Inverness, we stopped at the Elizabeth Baptist Church, which is the family cemetery for the Anderson descendants. I got to see headstones of many of Buck Henley's children and grandchildren. I even got his funeral photo from his daughter Pig. My grandmother then showed me where her mother and father were buried, in unmarked graves without headstones. Back then, if you died today, they wrapped your body and buried you in a pine box the next day. Unlike today, where you would be placed in a vault with a casket. They didn't have that back in the late 30s and 40s, but she would always remember where they were buried. Then we went over to see some of Sarah's children in Inverness. You see, they were the ones who took care of Ernest and Henry when Elizabeth died. And up the street is where Ernest lived. I guess you can see why they call him Tippy. Before we left Alabama heading back to home, Gert took us over to my grandma's sister's, Red's house in Georgia. Her daughters Brenda and Beatrice came over to see us. My goodness, it was interesting to see so many people who looked like her. Before we left Georgia, Red showed us her garden out back and gave my grandmother some of her plants, like her snow on the mountains. Then before we left, we had a cookout. All during our stay, people would drop over to see them, like the Fitzpatricks, some of the other people who grew up with them and even went to school with them, and other family. It was just amazing to see how in the South, you felt like all you had was family and faith. And that's all that mattered. Family came around to see you and to hear how you were doing and to share how they were doing. Yeah, I couldn't wait to get back home, to do more intensive researching into our history. That next year, we went back. But this time, I wanted to go to the probate office to see birth, marriage, and other pertinent records. I dragged my mother along and the kids because this was their story too. Yep, and Chantel went along. I'd met some amazing women on the internet mailing list. Those were email distribution groups that existed for genealogy. And we made a plan to meet up in Pike County to do some research. And that's just what we did. Emily is related to my cousin Elizabeth Cope. Yes, she was named after her grandmother. Orletta is a Drake, and she's related to the McGrady's and the Masons. So that's how we're related. Then we were blessed to have met Addis Thomas. She is a descendant of Robert McGrady, the slave owner. So we all met up and shared notes. Addis and Orletta were just a blessing to Emily and me. It was just amazing to meet people who just genuinely wanted to be of help because they understood this was not our doing, but it was all of our stories, and they were all intertwined. We can accomplish so much more together than apart. Now, next we went over to Pike to look at some slave records. Slaves were considered property. An individual had to pay taxes on their property. The slaves weren't recorded, just how much you had to owe for the county. I found some birth, marriage, and death records. I was just ecstatic. This was 10 plus years before Ancestry or Family Search ever documented probate records. So yes, again, I was ahead of my time. Later over the years, I've ordered records like Social Security applications because I wanted to not only see their handwriting, but to see just what information they recorded, like their actual birth dates and their parents' information. So needless to say, these are the 12 identified children of Henry, but there were some outside children that were recorded in the book I published titled We Are Family. They will forever be counted as his children. Now to date, I have identified 10 generations of family members and at least 78 grandparents. They say I should have 512 grandparents. With a little help from others, maybe one day I'll be there. Imagine how many struggles and battles and difficulties they had to overcome just for me to be here. This documentary, Look Where He Brought Me From, highlights the life and story of the Andersons and how in their own way they've influenced racial discrimination on the job. And yes, this is my grandmother fighting for the rights of all workers at Strong. And how they were willing to organize and stand up and testify how we all deserve to be treated with respect and with dignity. Yes, this is my grandmother and her niece Leela Mack. We called her Honey. They were both delegates and helped to rally the Union into existence there is strong. And then, this is my mother, Miss Carrie Rice. Those years of stress and strain weren't for nothing. God was equipping her for the day when her voice and tenacity for fairness in corporate America was not only a blessing for her, but for others all around the world. Today, my lineage is through 6 generations of Andersons, descending from a little southern town named Bullitt in Barber County, Alabama, and how each generation unknowingly has strived to make a big difference in the lives of others in their own way. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, D.A. Brown Consulting, for the premiere in February 2022, Black History Month, for Look Where He Brought Me From. And now for the premiere. Look Where He Brought Me From is an adaptation of the published work titled We Are Family by author and descendant Delbert Brown, who after 30 plus years of researching her family's history during the 2019 pandemic, published her findings, which narrates and chronicles the life and times of her ancestors. The movie, Look Where He Brought Me From, brings to life that work and tells the story of how the ancestors of Bullitt County, Alabama, leveraged their faith and love of family to help them persevere through trials and tribulations of slavery to experience what became the new normal of freedom, while yet witnessing a hanging in town and participating in a national movement to obtain reparations for former slaves. Now, 150 years later, their descendants leave their mark on society from all across the U.S. to as far as Europe, as they too represent others in their fight for fairness. You'll laugh, cry, and be amazed at how the love of family and faith can help you persevere and overcome all obstacles. Subscribe to the D.A. Brown Consulting YouTube channel for upcoming backstory information and for the release February 2022. BioT brewed herbal teas for people with underlying health conditions. Do you love eating pasta, breads, and starches? You know, food with people health conditions shouldn't have? Then try BioT's signature unique teas, which are made from 12-ounce concentrated specialty blends into ready-to-drink beverages that can be enjoyed throughout the day, at work, while eating, or just relaxing at home. Our formula is made from herbs to create our specialty blends like sage tea for diabetics, Wonder Brew for aches and pain, inflammation, and other health challenges, Nuna Brew for diabetics and pain, and Passion Brew for the lover in you. BioT, one try, and you'll be hooked.